Good morning, everyone, and happy Wednesday to you. I pray that your Tuesday gave you spaces of joy, gave you spaces of peace, gave you spaces of reflection and introspection. And those last two are new. I've decided to add those in because as we talk about triggers, as we talk about lowering anxiety, my prayer is that you will begin to do some reflection. You'll begin to do some introspection. That this will not just be something to listen to, but it'll be something that you will actually begin to practice, something that you'll begin to make personal, that you will not say, hey, that's pretty good for so-and-so, or let me tag such and such because they really need to hear that, or I wish he would actually listen to it, but that you would begin to make this thing personal, to begin to challenge yourself to look at yourself, to look at your spaces and places where you may become triggered, where you may find yourself behaving in ways that you're not that pleased with, behaving in ways that you really wish you could change, but it has not seemed to happen thus far. Someone wrote in and said, well, now that we've identified who triggers us, what do we do about it? Well, it's not that simple. Once we identify that we are being triggered, that would be the first step, just identifying that you are being triggered. For some people, they do not have that level of self-awareness. What they believe is that something made them mad, something external to them. Triggers are something inside of you has been ignited based on what's external. I'll say that again. A trigger means something inside of you has been ignited by something external. That thing external did not necessarily cause you to be triggered. It just kind of awakened the trigger that was already deeply resided inside of you. So this work on working with triggers, how to manage them, is not short-term work. It's not abracadabra, let's get the recipe and get this done. This requires reflection. This requires introspection. This requires being honest with ourselves. This requires challenging ourselves on levels that some of us never have. This requires brutal nakedness, and I mean, in quotes, emotional nakedness, going to those places inside of you that may not feel very comfortable, those places inside of you that you may not necessarily want to admit that you actually do or feel, but it is a part of you and it is impacting your life. And so I want to talk today a little bit about situations that trigger us, and specifically this social distancing, this social isolation as a result of COVID-19. One of the things that's becoming clearer and clearer to me is that each day that we are confined to our homes, each day that we are practicing social distancing, each day that the media continues to stoke the fires of our fears and anxiety, that some of us are struggling to make it day by day. It's not the people in our house that's getting on our nerves. It's not the pets in the house. It's not the children. It's not any of those things. It's simply this situation. The situation is such that if you are a normal, or if you are a human being who has breath, this idea of not being able to congregate, this idea of not being able to be in community, this idea of not being able to operate self-will and go where we want, when we want, how often we want, eventually begins to grate on even the best of us. And all the positive affirmations, all the positive sayings, all of that sometimes is just not enough. So what do we do when that happens? What do we do when that happens? Well, let me share from my own personal experience. Yesterday was a challenging day for me. And initially, I really thought, I couldn't figure out exactly why. I didn't even realize that it was actually that challenging. What I knew was that I had some work that I was doing and it seemed to be a lot. And in my doing my work, I was interacting with someone via email and I began to feel irritated. And as I later began to reflect on where this irritation came from, I realized this irritation came from the fact that I don't even know the person who I was interacting with. This was not one of my fans. This was a part of my other work. I don't know this person, but in my opinion, this person was interacting with me in a manner that made me feel small, that made me feel worthless, that made me feel incompetent, that made me feel like I was being taken advantage of. And because I've done a lot of work on myself, I know when I take the time to identify what's being triggered, I know where those triggers came from. I know that the 64-year-old woman who was feeling irritated was being guided by the 8-year-old little girl, the 9-year-old little girl who did not know that she had a voice, the little girl who always felt small and always felt like she didn't really matter and felt like she was being taken advantage of. And so that was one thing. And then later on in the day, I got a phone call. And initially I said, maybe I shouldn't accept this phone call, but I did because it's someone who is a part of my life. And the phone call became a bit irritating as well. And so when I got through the call, I did not practice self-care by ending the call, but you know, that piece of me that still wants to, that struggles with letting go and practicing self-care stayed in the conversation. And so as a result, when it came time for me to go to bed, I had a difficult time falling asleep. And as I lay in the bed, I began to think about, okay, so what has contributed to this difficulty in falling asleep? And I began to review my day. And I remembered the irritation by email. And I remembered the conversation that I had. And I allowed myself to own where those feelings were coming from. I allowed myself to own what was being triggered and when had I felt like that before. And once I began to do that self-introspection, that reflective work, I was able to go to sleep. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that as we continue this social isolation, this social distancing, we will experience times like this. For some of you, what is really triggering some of your anxiety is this fear of, am I going to make it? We can all say, oh, we're going to make it, we're going to get through it, but the reality is more people have died from this virus now than people who died during the Vietnam conflict. And so while I do believe in walking in faith and believing and doing all the things that we need to do, that does not mean that we may not have thoughts about our own mortality. That's only human. So what I will say to you today to end this message is we're going to take baby steps and to be gentle with ourselves. That when we find ourselves feeling sad, when we find ourselves crying for no reason, when we find ourselves being more irritable than normal, to take a deep breath and do some reflection, do some introspection, do some self-inventory and monitoring, but most important, be gentle with ourselves on purpose. I love you, and we're all in this together, and together we can keep each other sane and whole. Until tomorrow, have a great day.